Hello, good evening. Can everybody hear? Hello, good evening. Can everybody hear? Thank you. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to take them. So please type them out on the chat and I'll respond with audio. For some reason, the video feed doesn't seem to be working, but we are working on it. And hopefully, we should be able to manage that shortly. I hope the class has been enjoyable for the past 4 weeks. It was very intense, short, and rushed, but we did manage to cover about 3,000 years of the built environment in India. The camera is still not working. Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The aim of the course was to have a small condensed packet by which students who ordinarily do not have the time to take a conventional course will be able to learn. And because the course content will be available online, anybody can use it at any point. Okay, about neoclassical and Gothic. Unfortunately, since we don't have a video feed, uh, it is difficult, but let me talk to you about what the big difference is. Uh, Visuals would have been helpful, but let me start. With the neoclassical architecture, what you have are a number of columns that remind you of Greek and Roman temples. With a triangular pediment on top. That's not showing there. And so the whole thing looks like the Acropolis in Athens. Most of the buildings look very similar. In terms of Gothic architecture, it consists of a number of pointed arches and very tall vertical elements. So think of something like Victoria Terminus, now called the Shiv Chhatrapati Terminus in Bombay. And you will know what Gothic is. It's what you see in a number of churches. Whereas if you look at old churches in Calcutta or Bombay, the very first churches, or the residency in Hyderabad, that is neoclassical. Neoclassical is trying to emulate the architecture of the Greeks and the Romans, whereas neo-gothic is trying to imitate the architecture of medieval churches in Europe built between the 12th to the 15th century. Ah, and Ivan is a large 2 or 3 storied portal. A portal is nothing more than a big gateway. And this is the kind of structure you see in the middle of a monumental building. So, for example, if you look at the Taj, which everybody knows from memory, you do have a big 2 storied open portal in the center of the facade of the building on all 4 sides. That is an Ivan. It is just a large gateway. Now it looks like we might be getting some visuals, and so I will be able to illustrate what an Ivan is. Clear it. Good evening, Sridhar. Good evening, Sanyukta, Kanupriya, and everybody who has entered something on the chat window. Face appears. Yes, the visuals have been a problem. We are still trying to fix it. It was working earlier when we tested it, but we are not getting a camera feed in. So for now, you just have to pretend we're all in a dark classroom and I'm talking to you. Okay, so I will answer both the questions in the sequence that they've appeared. The concept of a Vastu Purusha Mandala is one that comes from the Vedic period, where it is believed that every piece of the earth actually can be mapped onto a demon who has to be nailed down. And so you divide any piece of ground on which you want to build into a series of squares in which is laid out the figure of a seated human being or demonic being. This diagram was made popular by Stella Kramrisch in her 2 volume work called The Hindu Temple, which was published in the 1930s. And this becomes the basis for a number of new Vastu experts who tell you what part of the ground you should build in because of which part of the demonic figure it covers. So you don't want to put hot things on his stomach. You might want to put the heaviest things on his feet, and so on. It is not a design principle that is actively used in the construction of modern buildings, and certainly not in the construction of temples, mosques, or a number of buildings that we have seen. Now, for Sanyukta, the difference between quadripartite and four gardens, well, quadripartite really means divided into four quadrants. So, any square in which you draw two lines and divide into four equal squares would be called a quadripartite arrangement. A number of Mughal gardens will take a big square walled piece of ground in which they have two central lines through which water flows. This is called a chaharbagh arrangement because you have four square gardens in the four quadrants, in the midst of which you very often will have a building. What parts of the course have you found most difficult? this. Is it live? And is it working? Open multiple instances of the same thing. Yeah, that was me typing. But is the audio working? Lost a computer to a crash, and this is the backup computer. I see a number of questions. So the first one of which was, why is a South Indian temple called a kutina? Is it because of the kuta? That is absolutely right. The kuta, which is the small square edicule, that is one of the the other question is why some Western and Northern Mughal architecture were influenced by the Bengal roof. And it is because every frontier that the Mughals go to, they take back some of these things. This is how all empires operate. They take from the fringes of their empire certain elements which become high fashion in the center, and from there it is re exported. So the vernacular Bengali roof, which is seen by the Mughals in Bengal, is carried back by them to Delhi and Agra and Lahore, and from there it is re-exported everywhere across the country. And you see it also in the Deccan, in Rajasthan, and wherever the Mughals had any kind of presence. There are no religious texts in Islam on how to construct mosques or religious structures. However, there are architectural texts in Islamic societies. And so, all that you require in order to pray as a Muslim is something that indicates the direction of Mecca. This direction is called the Qibla direction, and the wall that typically indicates it in a mosque is called the Qibla wall. There are a couple of texts written in Gujarat in the 12th, 13th century, where the temple builders who write these texts are speaking of the different kinds of temples they are able to build. One of these temples is called a Rahman Alaya, which means it is the same artisans who are also building mosques. About the pattern of the exam, you will have 6 slides where you have to identify the name of the building, an important person, patron, or architect associated with the building, the period of the building, the location of the building, and a salient feature of the building. Each one of these identifications of these 6 images will be for 5 marks each. Following these 6, there will be 2 larger questions, which are both essay questions. An essay question should have an answer of no longer than 1,000 words. The exam should not take a lot of time, but you should have the ability to recall things you've seen and also try and explain things that you haven't seen based on what we have learned in class. I'm scrolling back to Sridhar's question, which is, can we determine the age of a building from an architectural style? A lot of times you can tell the age of a building based on an architectural style, but because styles also come in cycles, as we saw with neoclassical or neo-gothic, where 500, 600 years later, an older style becomes the new fashion and people start doing it again. What really tells you the age of a building is not just architectural style alone, but also also the construction technology used to build in that style. So the big difference between a Gothic church of the 13th century and the neo-Gothic building in Bombay in the 19th century is the way in which the buildings have been constructed. Of course, there are differences in the design, but the construction is what really gives it away. I do not need you to make maps. I am scrolling up to check one more question that we missed with all this. This is Kanupriya's question, which is, what is the Kalyana Mandapam in South Indian temples? And an answer to that is all temples, because they accommodated a number of functions, including social functions, had a great series of mandapas in front of it. A mandapa initially was just a pillared hall, but through time it started being an increasingly open space, particularly when mandapas started having corbelled domes for roofs. These mandapas had different names based on the functions that they housed, and Kalyana Mandapam was a name used for uh, halls, mandapas in front of temples, which were sometimes used for weddings. Kalyana being a stand in for auspicious in this case. For Sanyukta's question about layouts of temples, you do not have to make any layouts of temples. I think your engagement with architecture, for the most part, is going to be uh, by looking at buildings in real life. And therefore, if you're able to identify, date, and appreciate a building that you see, I think this class will have been successful. What do people think of the architecture in their own cities today, the cities that you live in? Do you think that architecture in your cities was actually better 100 years ago as opposed to now? In the meantime, I will answer Sridhar's question on fractal geometry and how it is related or not to Hindu temple architecture. Now, the geometry of fractals is not directly applied in Hindu temple architecture, though it is sometimes applied in Islamic ornament. The geometry of Hindu temples usually has to do with two geometric processes, one of which is called translation, where you stretch orthographic lines, and the other is called rotation, by which you rotate geometrical shapes around a single axis. Thus, when you have stellate or star shaped plans for a Hindu temple, the geometry is usually rotational. And when you have the kinds of temples we've seen with lots of small offsets, that kind of geometry is translational. We do not have real fractal geometry for Hindu temple architecture. Has everybody given a thought to the architecture of their own places, of their own cities, of their own towns, and whether it was better 100 years ago or is better today? And if you think it used to be better or it is better today, what kind of reasons would you have for it? That is right. In the city of Hyderabad, there is a lot of modern derived architecture, but you do have Art Deco buildings in Hyderabad. You might not have real modernism, but you certainly have some attempts at Art Deco. Yes, I think the climatic response to architecture 100 years ago um, was much better. A climatic response of architecture, every region had a different housing style that really derived from local climatic conditions. In hot and dry areas, it was thick walls and really high ceilings. When the colonial attempt at creating architecture in India was initiated, they kept with this program of having really high ceilings and ventilators very high up on the walls, because of which hot air could escape. Kanu Priya has a question. Why do we say we borrowed something from Persia or somewhere else? It may be that we gave them ideas because we were powerful economically in ancient times, and our merchants and artists used to travel. Kanopriya, I would love to agree with you, but we do have something called evidence. We know certain buildings uh, are found first in a certain location and show up later somewhere else. We also see what derivative architecture can be like. So we have seen attempts to copy, and you can usually make out what came first and what came second. It is true that Persia also borrows a lot of ideas from us, but in this period they are not in the realm of architecture. We certainly borrow ideas from the Achaemenids. We do not have a comparable uh, empire in the 5th century BC as ancient Iran did have. No, right? No, right? made with chana dal or jaggery is actually an urban myth. With chana dal or jaggery is actually an urban myth. Because there have been lots of tests done on all these mortars in which there has been very little found of the organic material that was put in. We have heard legends about the kinds of sticky substances, but remember, a lot of organics, if they were truly present in the mortar, would be swallowed up and eaten by a number of organisms unless they undergo severe chemical changes. They did put in certain kinds of seeds, they did put in certain kinds of proteins, but it was still mostly lime. Since everybody seems to be very disillusioned with the kind of architecture that you see around you, let me also remind you that architects are trying to sell lifestyles and not houses. Everybody is selling houses in apartment buildings that have absolutely no room for drying clothes. These are apartment buildings which are laid out for lifestyles that do not match ours. The designs are not in sync with our requirements. We require kitchens that get partially wet. We require open spaces where we can put out clothes to dry. And a lot of architectural designs do not cater to these universal needs within India. Almost every family in India has needs which are different from those in different parts of the world. Everybody has a grinding stone on which chutneys are made, and it would be so easy to have a roughened stone actually set into the kitchen countertop so that nobody has to sit on the ground and do it. That is correct. Vernacular architecture always relies on local material, and local material is usually suitable for local climates. If I am sure I will try and have another course in the humanities uh, at some point, but perhaps not so immediately, maybe in the fall after August. As for the question of which fort is strategically better, Daulatabad or Golconda, it depends on what kind of strategy you're talking about. Both forts are on hills in wide open plains. Both are supplied by water, but Daulatabad controls key trade routes in a way that Golconda does not. One another thing one remembers about Golconda is for all talk about it being completely impregnable, it has changed hands a lot of times. Sridhar's question was Vastu Shastra followed in Indian architecture, particularly in temple architecture or sacred architecture? There is actually no single text called Vastu Shastra. What people do is put together and cobble a number of different bits and pieces from different texts and cite them as Vastu Shastra. This whole notion that you have one building that teaches you how to build a temple does not exist till quite late. When you have earlier texts, such as the Samarangana Sutradhara or the Aparajita Pricha, these texts describe temples but do not prescribe how to build them. And so, sacred architecture, temple architecture, did not follow any oh,
The last portion they close it.
What's happening? So let's go. Let me just say something.
What is
It's out of focus. Any questions? Yeah, because they've I need to be able to see it. See the there. Cancel. You've given control back to us.
Yeah.
Sure.
Beyond. It looks like the technical problems we're having are not going to get resolved today, but we might schedule another session perhaps tomorrow. So thank you for bearing with all the glitches and hopefully talk to you all soon.